Glad to be back this evening for Bible study. Glad everybody made it back out. Was able to go to the nursing home this afternoon and visit with Joanne. It was a pretty good visit. We talked a little bit there, and some of the workers there at the nursing home have gotten to know me pretty much, and I kind of, I mean, not like real good, but you know, they know when they see me in the door, this is for Joanne. He's coming for Joanne. So, but it was good, and you know, there was other, like I've said before, if when I go to see her, sometimes the other residents there will talk to me and ask me, you know, are you a preacher and all this stuff, and it's just, you know, you can tell they like people to come and talk to them. It just, you know, you get a feeling that you don't get in any other way when you go to help people like that. So it's always beneficial to me, whether she's having a good day or a bad day. Today it was good. She was we were talking, and of course I told her everybody was thinking about her and you know how special she is to us and all that. So I truly enjoyed that. It's been a blessing to my life being able to do that, and not only that, I get to improve on my bedside manner skills which was one of my weakest areas. And a lot of men, you know, in the church, in general, probably that would be considered one of their weakest areas. It's just something that men are not always as astute with. So,
and it's one of the most important things as a preacher. I mean, you should be, as a preacher, you should be known in places like hospitals, funeral homes, nursing homes.
It's a skill you need, and the thing about it is, a lot of times, if you don't have that, if you don't get used to doing it, or at least, you know, have some know-how, you can say things to people that really are hurtful, and you don't mean it to be that way, you know. You know, in certain settings, and like I said, I'm still learning myself, but...
Like this, Brad, and I often tell a lot of people this, and I've learned this over the years. There's two places that a preacher will actually make multiple, I mean, it's just a whole lot more of an impact than you ever will in the pulpit, in your congregation, and that is two places. One is in the hospital, the other one is a funeral home.
Amen.
And these are times when people, they remember you because they are highly vulnerable, and they really look at this as a true blessing for someone to assist them in their time of need, and that will either make you or break you as they minister the gospel.
Yeah, it's like the Bible teaches that it is better to go into a house of mourning than into a house of laughter. When people are mourning, they are most receptive to changes in their spirit. That's when their spirits are taxed like that. That's when they actually start to question things at a core level and are more open to making those changes than when things are going great and hey, let's let the good times roll.
Yeah, people are very vulnerable at those times, and another thing I've learned, and this is, you know, I can pass this along to you guys. You probably already know this, but sometimes it's best if you're not sure what to say, just don't say anything. Just be there. Just let them know, you know, that you're there. So, but anyways, that was a good visit today, and always beneficial. So we've been studying in the book of Deuteronomy, and chapter 14 is a fairly short chapter. Are there any questions or comments on the book of Deuteronomy thus far?
That's good.
Okay. If there ever is, don't hesitate to stop or say something. I don't want to continue moving along if somebody's confused about something. A couple of key factors we need to always remember. This is the second generation. The first generation is off the scene now. They've made their mistakes, and God has determined that they're not going into the land, and so they're off the scene, and this is a whole new generation. We also remember the theme of Deuteronomy is to remember. They need to not forget blessings that God has given them and the mistakes they've made. And again, and I'm sure that you guys are, I maybe sound like a broken record, but this is a good lesson for us too, to remember things in our past, whether good or bad, and learn the lessons and the things that where we've failed ourselves or failed the Lord. We need to remember some things about those. We don't need to put ourselves in a guilt trip. God doesn't want us to, but you have to remember something and learn from that. Because if you don't, if you just, you need to know where you went wrong and to make sure to do better in the future. So that's what Moses is going to be getting across to Israel, and he's trying to give them the recipe for success when they get over into the land. That way God can be pleased with them. And in chapter 14, he's going to deal with certain practices and things that pagan nations would be doing in their idolatrous worship. And he's going to be dealing with certain foods and things like that. And he's going to come back and touch on the tithes that we've already went over. So you're going to be thankful that I went up there on the board and spent all that time where we talked about these tithes and things like that. You'll see here later on in this chapter why we did that. So in Deuteronomy chapter 14, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Ye are the children of the Lord your God. Ye shall not cut yourselves, nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God, and the Lord hath chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto himself above all nations that are upon the earth." Now that's kind of strange that he says, "Ye shall not cut yourselves," isn't it? But can we think of an instance where this very thing happened?
The only thing I can think of, I mean, this probably has nothing to do with it, but I think of Legion. The guy that was out there demon possessed, cutting himself.
That guy was not in his right mind.
He's not in his right mind. That's the only thing I can think of.
Did he do that?
Yes.
Well, let's turn over. That's a good example if he did. I didn't think of that. But let's turn over. What I had in mind briefly is 1 Kings 17 with Elijah. Now, Elijah, he has this contest, some people call it a contest, this battle with these 450 prophets of Baal, these false prophets. And look what it says. Now, I'm going to have to find my verse here. It's not actually in 17. It's, let's see here. I'm going to have to apologize. Let me find the verse here. Here it is. So, to set the stage here, Elijah, he goes to Ahab, and he says that it's not going to rain anymore until he says, and there's going to be a famine, or basically a drought. And Elijah, he confronts these false prophets that are leading the nation of Israel off into idolatry, or trying to. And so what happens is he says, let's figure out who's really approved of God and who's not. Let's figure this thing out. And so they get the altar together, and these false prophets, they try their turn first, and they're going to try to get an answer from God by fire on the altar. We're going to see the proof is in the pudding. And so in 1 Kings 18, verse 27, it says, "It came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them." Now, this is kind of funny. You ever wonder if there's humor in the Bible? Does God have a sense of humor? It says, "It came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, Cry aloud, for he is a God. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth, and must be awake. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their manner with the knives and lancets, till the blood gushed out upon them. And it came to pass, when midday was past, they prophesied unto the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that there was neither voice nor any answer." So these false prophets, they're trying to get Israel to believe in them and to follow them, and they're trying to get God to answer, or their gods, to answer with fire on the altar. And so part of what they did was this crazy behavior. They would cut themselves, and for some reason that was a practice that pagan idolatrous people did. So I just want to show you this, let you know it's not so strange for Moses to say this. This has been going on, and when you get to 1 Kings 17 and you read through that might seem strange, but this is a practice, some strange practice that they did. We can turn back to Deuteronomy now, by the way. But I just wanted to show you that, because it's not as strange as you might think. It's something that they did, and God said, this is a practice that's foreign to you. You don't need to be engaged in that. And so he's warning against these idolatrous practices. Now, beginning in verse 3, he's going to start a list of various animals and that would be clean and animals that would be unclean. And what he means by that, the clean animals were acceptable for them to eat, and the unclean animals were forbidden by them for them to eat. Now, just to show you, when I talk to people about the Bible, sometimes they say, "Well, I don't know anything about the Bible." I say, "Well, you might surprise yourself. You know more than you think." When we grow up and we see commercials and things out in the world, the Bible gets incorporated into that. For example, John 3:16 is on billboards and poster signs at sports games. I knew that growing up, even though I wasn't very versed in the Bible. But my point is, let me just ask the question, when it comes to meats that are forbidden by the Jewish people, what's the main one that everybody knows? Pork. Everybody knows that they're not supposed to eat pork. They're not supposed to eat that. So, yeah, we're going to see. He's going to talk about the hoofs and chewing the cud here.
I was actually surprised as I was sitting there reading through it. I saw hair. They're not supposed to eat rabbit either.
Really?
Yeah, we're going to see here. He gives a stipulation on what they could go by to what they could eat, and of course, they couldn't eat the pig or the pork. But I don't know if I'll read all through this, but we'll just read a few here. Verse 3, it says, "Thou shalt not eat any abominable thing. These are the beasts which ye shall eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat." Verse 5, these are kind of, we don't use a lot of these words. It's basically the deer family, the deer species, antelope, if you will. He says the hart, the roebuck, the fallow deer, the wild goat, the pygarg, the wild ox, and the cameos. And every beast, now look at verse 6, "Every beast that parteth the hoof and cleaveth the cleft into two claws and cheweth the cud among the beasts, that shall ye eat." So this would be, cattle, if you will, things like that, and certain beasts that they could eat. So if the hoof, now I wasn't raised on a farm, so give me a break, guys. I wasn't raised on a farm, but I do know enough to know that certain animals, they part the hoof. And when he says, does everybody know what chewing cud is?
Yeah.
I'm sure you do. I didn't know what that was for a long time, but it's interesting that the stomach of a cow, that food regurgitates back up and they chew on that. It's just, they get pleasure out of it. And it's a sign that they're satisfied, that they're full. And so he says the animals that part the hoof and chew the cud, you can eat those. But look what he says later on. He says in verse 7, "Nevertheless, ye shall not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the cloven hoof, as the camel and the hare and the coney, for they chew the cud, but divide not the hoof. Therefore they are unclean to you. And the swine, because it divideth the hoof, yet cheweth not the cud." So there's the pig or the hog, the sow, whatever you want to call it. So we see here, this is where this comes from. When you hear people talking about, well, that's not kosher for Jewish people, the pork and everything. This is where it comes from. It was a restriction that God gave the people of Israel back in Deuteronomy and other earlier books, actually, in Leviticus and things like that. But here's why I think that God gave this restriction. There's different opinions on it. Some people think it's for sanitary reasons, but I don't believe that's the reason. If that were the case, then why would we be authorized to eat any meat today? If that were the case, if it was unhealthy or something like that, why would God make it a blessing for us to have the meats today? The real reason I believe that he gave these restrictions is because there was a practice already going on at this time in idolatrous nations. They used certain animals predominantly, such as the pig and certain things like that, and they would sacrifice these and have feasts. Now, just in case Israel was they were trying to peer pressure them or invite them to these feasts, this nipped it in the bud. God said, "I'll take care of it. You won't even have to deal with the peer pressure." I said, "You don't eat that."
So yeah, that makes actually some sense, because where we get our Easter bunny from, that was actually there was a pagan goddess Easter that we derive Easter, all those words from, that come from her name. She was a goddess of spring, and it was a practice that they either sacrificed or ate rabbits, so that explains the hare being off the menu in that list. So there's actually some credence to that.
Yeah, I mean, if it were for sanitary purposes, I don't see how that would follow, because, like I said, well, let's just turn over to 1 Timothy 4 briefly. Pretty well-known verse. Maybe you've read it. He says in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, "Now the Spirit speaketh expressly in the latter times, some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth." So you know what this was rooted in. This was people who could not let go of Judaism. And they're saying they still can't, they're still trying to bind not only circumcision, but these dietary laws, these restrictions on the foods they could eat. And Paul said to Timothy that there's no need to do that.
Well, it's not only that. Other places in Romans where it talks about when he was talking about people that would eat meat and people that would eat only herbs or vegetables, there was also veganism in which people were trying to say, you can't eat meat whatsoever, that's unholy.
Right, and the thing is, God didn't say it was wrong to do that. He was just saying if you do, you don't need to try to bind that on others. Because we see here that God has created all meats to be received with thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I don't think it was for sanitary purposes. A lot of people would debate that with me, but where can you show me that I don't see anything in the Old Testament or New Testament that even seems to implicate that in any way. So, and I wouldn't make a big deal out of it. I'm just saying I don't see that. So to me, it seems more of a social deal to keep them separated from these pagan nations as far as they're getting too close and too the danger of intermarrying. That's what happens at feasts. It's a social gathering. That's where a lot of people meet up, and a lot of tendency for a marriage or a relationship to start would be in a social gathering like that. So that's why I believe that the food restrictions are given here. And like I said, I wouldn't be dogmatic, but that's what I would seem to think about that, or that's what it seems to be saying to me. Any questions or comments on the food laws here? So just remember, when you read about these clean and unclean animals, that's more than likely what it was for. And there may have been something else to it. If there was, I don't see any other purpose, because this is in the context where he says right here in the beginning, here's a practice of the pagan nations that you need to stay away from. And that's in the same context where he goes ahead and follows it up with the food laws. So he says you don't need to cut yourselves like theyese other practices that they're doing. Also, here's the animals you need to stay away from. Like I said, it seems to me there was a practice in motion at this time of these other nations doing that, and he said, these are unclean to you, and that'll take care of any peer pressure or any thought of you. For a man to go and do it anyways, he'd have to be it would be a presumptuous sin that we've studied. It'd be saying, I'm going to do this, I don't care what the word says. You'd have to be straight up, you'd basically be shaking your fist in God's face and saying, I'm going to do it anyways if you did it. Because it says here, you don't eat these. So that's what I would say about that. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm not going to read through all these. You can read through the chapter. I'm going to go ahead and go down to verse 21. Now here he's going to deal with these tithes that we've already studied before, where they would bring their tithes to the priest, and some of their the firstlings of the flocks and certain sacrifices they would eat as sacrificial meals there in the vicinity of the temple. He says in verse 21, Ye shall not eat of anything that dieth of itself. Thou shalt give it unto the stranger that is in thy gates, that he may eat it, or thou mayest sell it to an alien, for thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk. Now a kid was a baby goat or a baby sheep. So, but what he's saying here is, if an animal dies of itself, if it was not killed in hunting or something like that, that's off limits to you. You can sell it to an alien. It wasn't a sanitary law. It was just for some reason, maybe some practice going on. And he says there at the end, I mean, who would see the kid in his mother's milk? That's a strange. What would be the purpose of that? So that's obviously some strange practice that they were doing in pagan nations. So this is obviously a restriction for to keep them separated from these other practices in pagan nations. Another thing you can note about verse 21, this is an important verse. It has, there's three groups of people here in this verse. He says, ye shall not eat of anything that dies of itself. That's the Jew. He says, but you should give it to the stranger in the gates. There's the proselyte. Not the full proselyte, but the proselyte of the gate. He remained uncircumcised, cast off idolatry, and he would serve God in a limited way under the system of Judaism. And then you have the alien who was outside of Israel completely. He didn't worship God. He was a worshiper of pagan gods. So this verse has all three of them there. And so when you read through the Old Testament, you may see allusions to this before, but just remember this verse has the whole package right here. That's why this is an important verse. I've got it underlined in my Bible. Verse 22, he says, thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, that the field bringeth forth year by year. Thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there. The tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. So we've already studied in, I believe it was chapter, let's see here. Here recently in, I believe it was chapter 10. Chapter 10? Oh, it was chapter 12.
Oh, verse 5.
Thank you. Yeah, chapter 12. So we've already read in chapter 12 where he has already brought up this new practice of the tithes where they eat these sacrificial meals. So that's what he's referring to here. He's following up and giving some additional information. Verse 24, it says, if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money, bind up the money in thine hand, and thou shalt go to the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Now, this is why I like studying Deuteronomy in these Old Testament books. There was gray areas in the law. You know, it wasn't so stiff and rigid as we might think. You know, he said if it's too far for you to carry your herds and all your tithes, if it's too much of a trouble, sell it where you're at, carry the money to the temple, and then buy the animals you need when you get there. So they sold certain things there around the temple. We see in Jesus' day they were selling certain animals and things for sacrifices, pigeons, doves, and of course they were really commercializing. That's when Jesus cleansed the temple out. But they were allowed to do that so long as it was in a certain way and according to due order. But he says if it's too much trouble, just sell it and bring it to the temple and buy the stuff when you get there. Verse 26, thou shalt bestow the money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for the oxen, for the sheep, or for wine, for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth, and thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. So we see here this is about the tithes. It's, you know, he's saying don't forget about the Levite. Don't let him go without, and make sure that he gets the support that he needs. Verse 28, he says, at the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thine gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come, and shall eat, and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. So this second tithe that we studied last week, where it says he wants you to bring all that to the temple and have the sacrificial meals, you got to remember that Israel lived on a 7-year clock, if you will, or grid
Cycle.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. A 7-year cycle. So every 3 years, twice in that 7-year cycle, the third year, instead of having to go all the way to the temple, he said, lay it up within your gates. That is, in your houses or in somewhere around your house, and you can go ahead and eat it there in your community. And the Levites with you, because the Levites were spread all throughout the tribes. They didn't have an allotment. So we see there that, and he says the stranger and the widow and the fatherless. That's another thing that's impressive about the Old Testament. God has a special interest for people who are unfortunate, people who are weak, and people like that, and people who are in need, if you will. And so we see the benevolence of God right here in the Old Testament, in these Old Testament passages, and it comes full bloom, of course, in the New Testament, where he talks about caring for the poor and the strangers, or the widows.
And to leave the corners of the field, is that correct?
Yep, they would leave. You see, whenever they would pick their crops, some of it would fall off. He said, "You're not going to go back and escape that up and be greedy." He said, "You can leave that for the poor," and that's interesting too. That's what Ruth did. Remember, we in the book of Ruth. So she would be doing that. And I know I may be opening up a can of worms here. I know it says strong drink in this chapter. I don't know what I want to say about that. I honestly want to do more study on it and figure it out. Maybe you guys have a comment or question on it. I want to do more study on it myself, but I don't really have much of a comment on it. There's got to be something that I definitely want to study it more and look more into it. But as far as any questions, does anybody have any questions or comments on that? I thought maybe somebody might be curious or something.
You might just be talking about fruits or things that fermented and maybe gotten.
Right. I mean, there was wine. When it says wine, it doesn't necessarily have to mean alcoholic. It can mean the fruit of the vine, So, like I said, I do want to do some more study. And, this would be a good place to do a word study. And then that's probably what I need to do. But I'm curious myself to look more into that. And I'll be honest, I couldn't tell you everything that's involved in this verse here. So, but that brings us up to the end of chapter 14. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Lord willing, on Wednesday we'll pick up and study chapter 15. Thank you for being here. Go ahead and move into our invitation for tonight. Tonight I want to look at a couple of verses. Actually, a couple of verses I read at the nursing home today when I was visiting with Joanne in Romans chapter 12. It's interesting to me that the book of Romans is so misused today. So many people use it. They talk about the Roman road to salvation. You might have heard of that in denominations and different religions. What they do is they'll walk through Romans and try to show how salvation is by faith only. But it's interesting, the whole Roman letter is hemmed up by obedience. In Romans chapter 1, verse 5, and chapter 16, verse 26, you have the phrase, the obedience of faith. And so Paul tries to get it across to let people know that salvation is trust expressed in our obedience. It's not simply by mental assent or faith only, if you will. But in chapter 12, he shows the results of obeying the gospel and living by the gospel of Christ. He says, in verse 1, he says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. So this is why we say that a Christian can never say, I've done everything I know to do. I can sit down on the bench now. I can be a bench warmer. I can sit down and I've done everything. I've accomplished everything I need. We never get to that point. Because Paul says here we need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. That is a continuous process. As long as we live on this earth that's affected by sin, we're going to have temptations out there. We're going to have things that we struggle with. And the good thing about that is, because it's easy to get doom and gloom in your mind when you think about the sin that's affected this world. But the good thing about that is when we struggle with sins and we use the gospel to overcome and tackle that sin, that's a great victory of faith. You know, that's a great thing. It's great to pray to God and work on things and finally get to the point where one day you realize, you know, I'm not struggling with that anymore. How did that happen? Well, it wasn't magic. It's because I put my nose to the grindstone and got the book out and looked at what the Bible said to handle it. And there's an answer in the Bible for everything. Any sin that you may be struggling with or any temptation you may struggle with, there's an answer somewhere. And it comes by going and looking into the Word, praying about it, and being transformed by the renewing of your mind. Because when we lived in the world before we obeyed the gospel, we were living by a different philosophy. We were that old man living by the flesh, and life was all about us, and the world, everything was centered around us. But now, as a Christian, our life is centered around others. We are selfless, and we have a different philosophy. We have a different mindset, and that involves living above sin the best we can, and taking those temptations and working on those and doing the best we can to get over them and to tackle them and to have the victory. So, Paul makes it plain here that we need to be transformed by the renewing. It's in your mind. This whole battle, this whole thing has to do with our mind. And Satan, he wants our mind. He wants to use anything he can to create that illusion to make us think the grass is greener and to pull us away from God. And it happens through the mind. So hopefully some of these things I've said can help you when you're thinking about your day-to-day life. And don't ever get to thinking that, you can sit down and sit on the bench and you've got everything figured out and you've done everything you need to do. Just don't fall for that. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, you can become a Christian by obeying God's simple plan of salvation by repentance, confession, and baptism. This is God's simple plan of salvation to be brought out of the world and into the church. If you're a Christian and you've strayed off the narrow path, you can be brought back into the fold by repentance, confession, and prayer. Whatever your need is, we're here for you. Please come as together we stand and sing.